please welcome your panel on The Chinese Economy in the Next 30 Years, Political Reform versus Status Quo, moderated by author and co-founder of Full Sky Partners, Cheryl Wu Dunn.
Greetings, everybody. I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late, but sit tight because we are charging back to the future. We are talking about China and the economy in the next 30 years, and there's a range of views. Some think that China's economy is in a bubble, it's going to collapse. Others think that it will be the dominant economy in the world. Just as the US dominated the world from the late 1800s to now, one of the biggest questions is, will China take over that role? We're going to solve that here now. So let me start with Michael. To my right, he's at the Hudson Institute and author of The 100-Year Marathon. We have Nick Lardy, who is at the Institute for International Economics and the author of The State Strikes Back. To my left, we have Sophie Richardson, who is China Director at Human Rights Watch, and she is author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence. Stephen Roach, to my second left, is at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and he is the author of Unbalanced. And to my far left is Perry Wong, who is the managing director at the Milken Institute, and he is author of Best Performing Cities, China 2018. So we have a wide roster of experts. So, Michael, let me start with you. But first, let's show a few slides. Number 3, 4, 5, 6. Can we show those? Okay, this is just level setting so you get a sense of how far China has come in the last 30 years. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, you can see before and after, Tale of Two Cities. Next slide. And these are trains. There are going to be a lot of trains in this presentation. So you can see China's old trains and new trains. And finally, the last slide. The next slide, yes, this is the Belt and Road. So let me talk about the Belt and Road. When President Xi, Michael, he came into office in 2013, he had this idea of the China Dream, which is kind of like the American dream, but China's dream. And he basically launched the idea of this One Belt, One Road, which is now the Belt and Road Initiative. It was enshrined in the Communist Party Constitution 18 months ago. Just a few days ago, President Xi brought in world leaders from around the world to discuss the Belt and Road. So you're advising President Trump. What do you tell him about China's intentions and whether it will dominate the world?
Well, President Trump actually knows a lot about China. He's mentioned it in 3 different books he wrote before he was president. He has pretty strong views about China. He sees China in a very competitive way, which you would expect given his New York real estate world. He sees the chance to make a deal with China in terms that he's written about.
So what do you advise him to do?
What do I advise him to do? Well, actually, the way it works in the Oval Office usually is he asks me questions. I don't say, President Trump, this is what you should do. That's a good way to get yourself not invited back to the Oval Office, no matter which president I've been advising.
Do you insinuate?
Do I what?
Do you insinuate your...
No. What President Trump likes, I'll give you a feel for his decision-making style. He likes to sit behind the big desk himself. He has a lot of chairs in the room for cabinet secretaries. So he'll have Steve Mnuchin here and Larry Kudlow here and Peter Navarro. Vice President Pence gets a very good front row seat. The visiting expert in my case sits on the president's right. And then in the back usually would be the chief of staff, would be Jared Kushner, NSC staffers. And there's a kind of a freewheeling seminar. Something like the way Steve Roach probably teaches economics at Yale, where his students bicker among themselves, and the president either listens or he sometimes actually instigates the debate to get worse. So my only role is as a resource person who, for example, I'll give you an example of his interest and was something I was able to answer. Why did China do so well over the last 30 or 40 years? Who created this? And I told him the story of President Nixon in an interview with Bill Safire, saying that I think I've created a Frankenstein's monster in China. Nixon's referring to his opening up the original investment in technology. So it's actually a very complex story of how Mao's wife, the so-called Gang of Four, had their economic policy. They end up in jail. They lose a very rough, tough power struggle. Another group then reaches out to the World Bank. And before long, by 1980, the World Bank president at the time, Bob McNamara, came. The World Bank loaned some economists. One in particular is sort of a hero in China. There are two actually, E.C. Hua and Edwin Lin. The World Bank opens its largest office in the world in China, in Beijing. And they have blueprints from other countries, especially the way the Yugoslavs had done state-owned enterprises.
But are you
So
really
this
crediting
story
the
in
World
the 80s,
Bank?
absolutely. The World Bank plays a crucial role.
Okay.
But the Chinese economists have their own debate going at the time. As I mentioned, some end up in jail. Some are accused of not being properly Marxist. And a series of issues that are still with us today in Beijing get surfaced in the 80s. And one thing that President Trump is doing, I think, in his trade, I hate to say demands, his requests of China. There's a 24 points that the American side raised 1 year ago today in Beijing. The Chinese side raised 10 points, trying to cling to their old system. And a lot of this is like the debate back in the 80s, in which the issue became subsidies, tariffs.
We're going to get into the actual trade talks a little bit later.
This
so-
is the old story,
Right,
35 years ago.
okay.
Well, you wanted to know how President Trump makes decisions. He has quite an ear for nuance and detail. And I think his trade strategy is part of a much larger approach that used to be called G2 by Zbigniew Brzezinski and others, that he often talks about his friendship with Xi Jinping. He's revealed they've had almost 30 phone calls, an hour long each. They've had long sessions with each other. He's accepted a number of Chinese ideas to go over to the four dialogues to eliminate the old Hank Paulson system of the strategic and economic dialogue. He's made quite a few changes. He at first shocked the Chinese, really shocked them, by taking the phone call from Tsai Ing-wen.
Right.
And then calling her the president of Taiwan. This is like an enormous taboo for all China experts. We get our hands chopped off if we propose this kind of thing. But he then, just summarize in one sentence, he then changed what the previous 8 presidents had been saying. Instead of saying, I accept the one China policy, because other presidents have, he said, because President Xi Jinping called me and requested, I'm going to abide by our one China policy. This is a kind of negotiations that he got going from the very beginning, that I'm going to rethink the basis of U.S.-China relations, but cooperation will be the key to it.
Nick.
Not a new Cold War. He doesn't, sometimes the media gets crazy and says, oh, Trump wants a new Cold War with China. No, that's not correct.
So, Nick, can you talk about how, a lot of people think that they're worried about China and that China is going to start dominating, it does dominate in world trade and that it's going to become the dominant economy in the world. But China's also very overextended, has enormous amount of debt, the fastest growing debt that we've seen. Official figures say 47% of GDP, but who knows what the real level of debt is? Can you talk about, is this going to actually really hurt the Chinese economy going forward?
Well, the debt level is very high. 47% might be a good number for the direct debt of the government, but if you take all the corporate and household debt, we're talking more like 250, 270% of GDP. So they are highly indebted. There are substantial financial risks, but it's all financed in renminbi. They're not borrowing anything significantly offshore. So China is not going to have something like we saw in the Asian financial crisis, where foreign lenders got nervous and decided to withdraw their money. And the state in China has a lot of policy tools to deal with financial risk. And they're quite sensibly deleveraging now. It's a slow process, but it is underway, and I think the risks are going down.
In the 1980s, we were all scared of Japan. Japan was growing, and then it turned out it had this pile of debt and just sort of collapsed onto itself. Is there a risk that China might have that kind of similar fate?
I think China's fate will be quite different. Remember, Japan at that time was already at roughly 75% of the U.S. level in terms of per capita income. China's about 25%. So China has enormous potential for further convergence towards the levels of advanced industrial economies. I think they'll have to change policy to capture that, but I think that means their growth potential is much greater than Japan's was back in the 90s. They've had some property inflation in China, but it's much less than the Japanese had in the mid-90s. And the other huge difference, of course, is China's much more open to foreign investment. Foreign investment in Japan never produced more than 1% of industrial output. In China, it's been 25% for decades, and it continues to be a very important factor in their economy, an important source of productivity growth. So I think there are enough differences that we should not anticipate that China is going to fall into the fate of Japan. Not right away, maybe in a couple of decades when they're even richer than they are now, but not when they're only at 25% of the U.S. level.
Is it possible to get a handle on the shadow banking system? Because there's also a lot of hidden debt, and there are some estimates of the debt levels at 300% of GDP. What do you think of those?
Once you start getting into the details, you have to worry about a lot of double counting in terms of the overall debt levels and where the credit's coming from. I think a number at the peak was probably something closer to 270, 280. But they've made very substantial progress in reducing the size of the shadow banking system. In other words, it's not just growing more slowly than it used to, it's actually shrinking. This was the riskiest part of the financial system because it's less well regulated. And last year, the assets in the shadow banking system shrunk quite substantially. Now, there's been collateral damage. The private sector, which relied a lot on shadow banking for financing, is in pretty dire straits these days, so there's been a cost. So they've reduced financial risk to some extent. It's partly at the cost of a less vibrant private sector, which of course has been the main source of growth over the last 40 years.
Great, okay. So I'd like to get back to the BRI that we opened with and show a video that talks a little bit about the breadth. Can we show that first video, please?
The multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. They're also the two components of the plan. There's an overland economic belt of 6 corridors that serve as new routes to get goods in and out of China, like this railroad connecting China to London, and these gas pipelines from the Caspian Sea to China, and a high-speed train network in Southeast Asia. Then there's the Maritime Silk Road, a chain of seaports stretching from the South China Sea to Africa that also directs trade to and from China. The BRI also includes oil refineries, industrial parks, power plants, mines, and fiber optic networks, all designed to make it easier for the world to trade with China.
So, Michael, you've written about the BRI as well. I mean, many of you have. I mean, is this China's attempt to sort of dominate the world?
You can look at the BRI in two different ways depending on your overall view of China. The idea of dominating the world, and this is the big octopus putting its tentacles out, that usually fits if you think of China's strategic intentions in the long term as evil. I happen to advise against embracing the Belt and Road Initiative, but not because of Chinese long-term intentions. I think since the 1944-45 period, the United States and allies have tried to have standards for loans around the world, whether it's human rights, the right to strike, environmental issues, not locking workers into a factory so they can all be burned up by accident. It's a long list of these standards. There's a set of institutions, mainly in Geneva, to enforce these standards. The Belt and Road and the previous Asia Infrastructure Bank could have those standards in principle. They could have paid homage to this effort since 1945. Actually, it goes back even earlier to the League of Nations, but they didn't. And some particularly egregious examples have come out about how Belt and Road actually works. The U.S. government uses the word debt trap to refer to it. So I encourage you, Cheryl, to buy this. You really can't afford it. You default. I say, okay, now I'm taking your house. You say, I didn't really know you could take my house. I say, well, too bad. And this has happened with a number of small countries. So President Trump did not go to the Belt and Road, the first summit in 2017. His representative read off a short statement that American companies are welcome to benefit from this. He didn't go to this summit you mentioned 5 days ago. The number of foreign leaders who went was much less 5 days ago. And President Xi did something very clever. He revised the Belt and Road Initiative terms. And he implied he'd heard some feedback that wasn't all positive. So this is different. But still, I don't think the United States should sign up for a Belt and Road. The Italians, I think, betrayed us. The Italians were really bad to sign the memorandum that they signed. They are now serving as a kind of an opening into the rest of Europe. I noticed in London, Berlin, and Paris, they didn't totally endorse the Italian approach. But this is a matter of some debate. And as I say, it's really about China's long-term intentions and the standards Belt and Road is going to use.
Sophie, what do you think about China and its intent and so far the progress it's made on the BRI? Do you think that there are obviously some problems that they've faced around the Southeast Asia, around other parts of Asia? But what is your sense of the political ramifications of them progressing on the BRI?
Well, I think it's very clear that one of the Chinese government's intentions is to try to ensure tighter relationships with many of the countries along the BRI and to do business on their terms. I agree with Mike's point about the lack of standards that have largely been built into multiple different international institutions that are really either not at play at all or are being undercut by these kinds of projects. And research that we've done in countries ranging from Cambodia to Zambia show how certain kinds of Chinese investment, particularly in extractives, in industry, really not only failed to comply with established international standards, but in some cases even undercut the established local standards. And I think that's a problematic phenomenon. And it's not clear, who anybody goes to for recourse about those kinds of developments. But I think, the pathologies that we're seeing in BRI are not necessarily distinct from ones that you see in Chinese development generally. But it is that lack of standards that's a really critical problem.
But standards actually work better when there's competition. So China has no competition with some of these countries. It's not like the U.S. is there, saying, "Oh, what about us? What about us? Try us." And so that's why China can get away with it, right? Because it has more negotiating leverage.
Well, it has enormous power in many of these countries. And it's not just about competition, but it's also about enforcement. And one of our greatest concerns at the moment is not necessarily in the realm of economic institutions, but certainly of the ones that govern international law or human rights, where the Chinese government, I think, is very steadily weakening those institutions in ways that aren't immediately visible to the outside world, but that wind up having enormous consequences for the people who rely on them to protect their rights or uphold certain kinds of standards.
Steve, let's bring in, let's talk a little bit more about U.S.-China relations. A lot of skeptics think that a deal that is coming out may result in more soybean sales from U.S. to China. But can that really change the dynamic that we are seeing now? Michael, you hinted at it, but that we're going to have going forward with China. Will it fundamentally change market access? I mean, what's going on there right now?
Well, Cheryl, there'll be a deal. It's in the self-interest of both presidents having gone down this road to walk away with something that they can take back to their respective constituencies and say that they accomplished something. It remains to be seen if the deal will be huge or the greatest deal in the history of deals.
Granddaddy of them all.
But I think what is going on here is that the focus of the deal will be on the least consequential aspect of the tensions between the countries on this bilateral trade deficit. We have an enormous trade deficit with China right now. But what your local politicians, ladies and gentlemen, don't tell you is that we have trade deficits with 102 countries. The reason we have what is economists would call a multilateral problem is because we in America don't save. And when you want to grow without saving, you import surplus capital from abroad and you run a big current account and a multilateral trade deficit. And what the Trump administration has done with its tariffs is it's tried to propose a bilateral solution for a multilateral problem, and it won't work. It's like whack-a-mole. You can knock down the Chinese piece, but it'll shift to higher cost producers and end up taxing the American public. So, Michael says that the president knows a lot about China. It's clear he knows nothing about economics, despite the fact he went to Wharton. So the next time you go in there, Michael, you might bring your economics textbook with him and try to explain to him that macroeconomics has consequences.
You're willing to come with me to this meeting in the Oval Office?
I'm not going near that place.
I'll come.
Well, okay. All of a sudden, there's a lot of China bashing going on, and so everybody's jumping on the bandwagon. Is this because a year ago President Xi decided that he was going to be a ruler for life? What is going on here? Why all of a sudden is this coalescing around China bashing? All of you.
Well, Cheryl, I'll just finish.
Go ahead.
This. I mean, if I had a nickel for all the negative views on China, I'd be in better shape than Michael Milken. I mean, this has been going on forever. It is now a tidal wave. It's much larger than it's been before. And, I think we need, in this country, to look at China critically. And when there are things that they do that do not comport with what we think are fair standards of equity or reciprocal treatment, we need to call them on that. On the other hand, we need to look at ourselves in the mirror to try to get a better understanding of why it is we have this knack for blaming others for our problems. We did it with Japan in the 80s, and we're doing it again with China. And we have some serious problems in this country with our long-term saving and our productivity growth that we can best address ourselves rather than trying to pin the blame on China.
Is there a competition that is really now the new great game between the U.S. and China? Are we actually, you talk about we have to look into ourselves, but is this an issue where we need to, we feel kind of insecure because we're not as good as we used to be?
There is a clear insecurity, and I just go back to the macro issue. When countries are short of saving, and the numbers are pretty clear, you look at our domestic savings rate in the U.S., adjusted for depreciation, last year was 2.9% of national income. 2.9 for a leading country is zip. So we have to, bring in surplus savings from abroad, and China is certainly a major source of that, as is Germany, Japan, other surplus countries. And when you don't save and you want to grow, I mean, you gotta ask yourself, how do you fund our investment needs, like expanding and modernizing capacity, infrastructure, human capital, the saving issue is a serious long-term source of our insecurity, and here we are, pounding on others without really addressing what we need to do at home.
Mike, I just want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier, that you were involved in the security cooperation between the U.S.-China years ago. And so obviously if you can talk a little bit about what kind of security secrets we gave to China and whether or not, in hindsight, that was a mistake. It's coming back to haunt us.
Well, you have to buy a copy of the 100-Year Marathon, which, by the way, is now the best-selling book on China in America. That could be good or bad. But there's a long chapter that the CIA and FBI and DOD made some cuts, but they let the main chapters stand. And in the Chinese military translation, they keep all that story too. It's a story of very intimate cooperation in terms of weapons, intelligence, covert action between the US and China that's been kind of the secret foundation for the leaders on both sides and their immediate staffs. It was not shared inside our government. It was not shared inside the Chinese government. Certainly wasn't shared with NATO or Japan or our allies. So this secret cooperation with China included the largest covert action in our country's history, buying more than $3 billion worth of weapons from Chinese factories, secretly conveyed to be given to fight against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. This was about a 6-year program. There was another program a little earlier to try to drive the Vietnamese army out of Cambodia. Remember, they had invaded Cambodia. They're going to stay forever. CIA and the Chinese equivalent, together with Malaysia, Singapore, hosted by Thailand in a secret base, provided weapons and eventually drove the Vietnamese army out. Dr. Kissinger started this in a very famous top secret eyes only memo, only recently released in November of 1973. In public, Dr. Kissinger still tends to give, as he should, the cover story. He says, oh yes, China and the US wanted to have a hotline so we could contact each other in case of trouble. But actually the memo is that, for better or for worse, I helped to write, said you have all your bombers on one base. This is strategically unwise. The Soviets could take out your entire nuclear force in 10 minutes. You need radar warning, you need to hook up to our satellite systems, and we can help you in technology. If you go to war with Russia, we will help you with supplies. This was all kept secret since that time, and it helps to have a best-selling book if you tell these kind of stories with footnotes and links to the declassified documents.
Okay, last commercial.
But the important thing now, when President Trump learned about all this, obviously it gives him a view of the potential of U.S.-China cooperation. It's not a story of fighting each other to death. The Korean War is that kind of story, but this is an evolution of U.S.-China relations. And I maintain in the book, that I won't promote anymore, that the economic cooperation in the 80s and the World Bank getting in there, that also was a kind of secret collaboration, if you will. Now, this has all gone wrong in the last 10 or 15 years, because I don't think the World Bank taught China to steal, to lie, to cheat, to create espionage activities in the U.S. far beyond what the FBI director's ever seen before. I don't think the World Bank did all this. Someone else did. And how to correct that is the current problem.
Okay, well now we're going to actually propel forward. And so, Perry, I'd like to ask you a question about going forward and China's prowess. But first, I'd like to show the second video briefly to give us a sense of China's manufacturing prowess. Can we... Okay. So, Perry, I don't think that we could build anywhere in the U.S. a train station as large as that in 9 hours, could we? But at the same time...
9 years, probably.
At the same time, going forward, China is going to have to, continue to grow. What do you think about the prospects for growth in China, and what are some of the risks that you see?
I think the Chinese government, whether it's 100-year plan or otherwise, which I don't totally subscribe. If they have a long-term vision that far 100 years ago in surpassing U.S., I don't think that's the intention, but that's a slogan. But communist government tend to have big slogans. That's for one. But I think the growth story in the next 5-10 years in China would be similar to the past. We actually tend to give too much credit, I think, one way or the other, whether the Chinese plan out that far along how they want to grow or they have no idea what they want to do. I think it's somewhere in between. I believe the Chinese government have a long-term goal. I think the long-term goal is very simple. By a certain time benchmark, that the household income should achieve a certain level. And that's very vague, actually. So along with that, and then they did learn something from World Bank, and they did learn something from economists like Stephen, me, and Nicholas, all included, by learning that, okay, technology is important, science is important, education is important. And I think those are simple ingredients. And so if you look at the past 10 years, the Chinese government, without exceptions, I would say, no matter how their 5-year plan printed out, they do a lot of adjustments. Sometimes when you look at them, you felt that some of the policy changes are pretty pathetic. You have a central bank in 2015, for example, just one case in point. In one of the critical juncture in doing the financial market reform and opening up, they have in short 3 weeks come up with 3 different policy directives on how they plan to open their capital markets. And of course, it was a big crash afterward. Now, are they related? No one can tell. But as you can see, the Chinese government sometimes they go out their way to adjust. They call it fine-tuning, but sometimes they just have to do quick dance to change direction or to fix the problem. So that's a more example. So a better one, I think I like to, at least I like to hold that for a while to think about, and maybe that would be a theme for the growth in China, is that they know where they want to be, but how to get there, they have to deal with a lot of options. Now, in the past 30 years, it was simple. The country was bankrupt. They have to feed the people. They have to provide jobs. So it's simple. You just produce. Whatever you can get, you produce. You have to feed all those mouths and provide jobs to the teenagers and youngsters. That's a simple story. It's no different than other developing economies. But now, the Chinese have to deal with the following question. Shrinking workforce, aging workforce, horribly destroy environments. So the Chinese government now, I believe, they have to look back and say, gosh, we need to fix those numbers. I think our chairman actually like to quote a number that the cancer or chronic diseases in China would be about the size of the United States population, or could be above, who knows. So they have to go back in time to fix those. Now, in that process, we probably will see, I think I would call abnormal period of time that in power consolidation, in setting up a goal that how to protect the nation, so to speak. But I think the policy, they are going to set goal, but they're going to change. And I think further, the concern, I think, in Chinese leadership's mind, I don't think is South China Sea. I truly believe that. If I look at the domestic condition in China nowadays, there are better tasks to tackle and more urgent difficulty that they have to deal with on a daily basis.
Well, so look at the manufacturing prowess that has actually achieved remarkable, miraculous success in China. Going forward, I mean, their labor is no longer cheap, land is no longer cheap, so they can't really use this same economic model. It's kind of like the old economy. Can they actually transition to the new economy, a newer economy, a different model? At the same time, have tighter control, tighter state controls, tighter, if you will, repression.
Yeah, I think that's a contradiction. That's another contradiction from the Chinese government policy, at least from an economist's perspective. And my colleague and I have done a lot of work in the Institute trying to understand technology, human capital, and systems, how to make it work. And one of the key elements in creating a prosperous, vibrant R&D or technology-based economy is human capital. Now, on human capital, you have to allow the people to have dissenting opinions. You have to allow people to have different type of thinking. It may not be prevailing theme in a society. Those are the key ingredients. So you can say, I don't like IBM, so someone long time ago make that statement and move the company to Silicon Valley and start their own firm. So you have to allow that kind of leniency or that kind of space. But the Chinese government policy now is that we try to build consensus. We try to build a consensus that narrowly focus on where we should go. And everything focus on this. One of the most ridiculous policy is they look at the Chinese small town by saying, okay, those small towns are so remote from the center of the industrial complex, so we couldn't find way to grow them. So what do? We call them special cultural town. They build thousands of them. The problem is, yeah, Xinjiang is very different than Guangzhou, and then Shanghai is very different than Shanxi. Yeah, you have the differences. But then can someone justify within a 300 kilometers, you build two culture centers? Literally, they are within one village. So you are trying to attract tourists. While the Chinese tourists actually favor more on Thailand, on Philippines, Japan, Korea, US. So those are the things that the total disconnect between policy and reality. So they're going to do a lot of quick adjustment to answer those.
Right, okay. So Sophie, if you look at in the past, we've always looked at the economic development of some of the Asian countries, and as the middle class rises and becomes more affluent, then they start wanting to have a say in their own governance. That so far hasn't happened in China, and in fact, they're getting tougher. What do you think the chances are for political reform, and can China continue to grow without it?
Yeah, well, a couple of quick points. I mean, first, I think on the occasions when anyone, or lots of different kinds of people in China have tried to assert a desire for more lenient rule or the ability to participate in politics or to share their views free of the prospect of being persecuted for it, they get crushed pretty quickly. I mean, let's recall that we're heading towards the 30th anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. And we're not any closer to a China in which you can start an opposition political party or go out and launch a new newspaper or, even engage, frankly, in independent agreement with the government on certain kinds of topics without fear of persecution. We knew that it was not going to play well for human rights under Xi Jinping when in the fall of 2014, a group of activists who called themselves the New Citizens Movement, who were generally about public asset disclosure and anti-corruption campaigns, who were essentially saying publicly the same thing that party officials were saying, but they were saying it independently, they all got locked up. I think that's a pretty powerful indication of how hostile the state can be to this kind of engagement, and that has enormous ramifications for the economy. But let's also talk about areas where the Chinese government has invested very deliberately and heavily and demonstrated very alarming creativity, which is in the high-tech surveillance sector, and the ways that technology is being used to monitor all different kinds of behavior and penalizing people for it. Keep an eye out. We have a new piece coming out actually this afternoon in which we reverse engineered a police app that's being used in Xinjiang that shows you the hard coding of repression through Chinese companies in ways that have horrific consequences for human rights. And I think when you see a government literally invest in that, I think the hopes for any kind of political reform in the sense that we understand that term, or even in the rationalization of bureaucracies as Xi Jinping re-centralizes power to himself, that the kind of professionalization or sort of bureaucratization that we saw taking place across the 1990s and the 2000s has largely been reversed, and a lot of power essentially is being reconcentrated in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, it seems interesting that you could have, an economy that is so centrally controlled and tightly controlled at the same time, foster innovation. I mean, we have seen these pockets that you refer to. I mean, Ping An insurance company has this very interesting AI arm where they're now creating these robotic retina scans. So, and just in Chinese fashion, they're creating assembly lines where, the Chinese can go through their health checks, they go through these scans, and there's no doctor or practitioner on the other side. It's just basically a robot, and they can actually, test to see whether you have diabetes or, the US has a version of it too, but we're not going to create assembly lines the way the Chinese are. But that's a kind of innovation. So Perry, I know you've worked on this, and Sophie, you too. What do you?
Well, I just want to add to that. It's a kind of innovation, but where is that data going? Do people know it's being gathered? How do they get it back? Are they given the option to opt out or have any sort of privacy controls? Let's not treat this realm as an unmitigated good. It's very clear that some of this technology is being used for very abusive purposes.
Wait, but hold on a second. I was at a session yesterday at this conference called Surveillance Capitalism, featuring Shoshana Zuboff and Roger McNamee. And they tell a story about gathering of personal data in the United States of America that is every bit as comparable as what you just described in China. So by singling out China, you're overlooking the fact that this is a much more pervasive trend. Now, you may want to come back at me and say, well, they have different motives than we do. I wish I could run the videotape of that session where they raised serious questions about the motives of our large technology companies and what they're doing with our data and violating our privacy in a way that would be very comparable to the story you just told.
Well, if I can come, actually the first point I would make in response to that is to say I'm proud that Human Rights Watch does work on these issues all over the world, including in the US, where we've written extensively about violations of privacy rights. But I think the important point of comparison is that here there actually are privacy rights. And you could actually, go to court, elect a different government. The fact that you and I can sit here and have a conversation about this, without fear of running into problems once we walk out the door for having had this conversation, right? These are very different operating environments.
Well,
I'm not that frightening, I promise.
Well, let me ask this question, though, because in China, they don't care about data privacy, at least not now, and there's nothing that the individuals can do about it. Okay, even if they did care.
Actually, Cheryl, that actually is the issue. In China, the cultural norm, I was shocked, actually. After working in this country, I went back to visit relatives in Hong Kong and in China, and many that I don't know very well. And the first question they ask me is, how much do they pay you? How much do you make? And the next thing is, what kind of house do you live? Now, in the United States, if you ask someone that even you know very well, that's a very privileged information. You shouldn't ask. You shouldn't collect that kind of information. But, the funny thing about a Chinese household is there's very little secrets. I think if you ask people who live in Beijing, Hutong, or Shanghai somewhere, the old nannies in those blocks, they know everyone's movement. This person come back home at 3, that person come back home, he parties all night long. I'm not giving a judgment on whether that's a good or bad culture. But the Chinese or Asia, I should say in China, I'm not sure about Hong Kong, but at least in China, that's something I think one felt that is entitled to know if they want to know. So that is the attitude. And then actually one theme. When we critic on China's a lot of bad practices that I think from our standpoint is not the norm and so on and so forth. Actually, I thought a lot about that. Many, I think, from government, policy-driven or the government guidance in doing some of the things. But one prompted me to think about, some of the rude behaviors. I think if some of the traveler, if you travel in China very frequent, you probably don't want to ride in the same train as I did. I did a couple of times from riding a train in a high holiday season. Trust me, you don't want to be on those. You're going to bump into some of the rudest people you would ever encounter. So it's about social.
Do you ever go to New York?
I love New York, okay? At least for the food. So some of those, I think, is a progression of policy setting and progression in adapting the global norm. I think how we should look at individual rights. And that's for government and institutions in China to consider. Further, I think the Chinese citizens should understand there are standard behavior. You cannot be rude to people. When you get off the airplane, you cannot elbow someone in front of you to try to get off first. You stand in line. So those are the things, I think, so you get into social development, social cultural development. Those are the things, I think, not just the government, but I think the entire society in that corner of the world have to learn. And I believe the Chinese will learn it very quickly. It's not about good or bad. It's about all of a sudden, can you imagine, I think for the audience, the wealthiest builder in China, very similar to President Trump. He now is the largest builder in China, privately owned enterprise. And before he was 18 or something, he never owned a pair of shoes. Now, can you imagine someone like that day one landed in JFK and try to get in the taxi cab? I don't know how he behaved. So along the line, there's a lot to catch up work to do.
Well, so if you look at China and the fact that they can get away with, with not regarding people's data privacy, and they will be able to use all that, billion people's worth of data, and leapfrog, go far ahead in terms of data science, AI, machine learning. Is the U.S. going to be sucked in? I mean, we're going to lose that race, right? Don't you think?
The Chinese does have the advantage on data collections. Going back to Ping An's case, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I was in Beijing attending a conference, and because at the time I worked with my colleague Paul Irving on aging, so they took me to this new facility 3 hours from the capital, downtown Beijing. And they show me how they integrated the insurance policy with the retirees, their medical treatments, and potentially those people where they can travel to. So they issue a card to the holder, insurance holder, and also happen to be the residents of the retirement home. So they can track these old couples literally 24 hours. And so now, I think for me, I probably don't like that because I would like to sneak out the smoke. But for the old couple, they have no problem. They said, we are being taken care of. And so their bank account, their health condition, all in that card. Now, what's enabling Ping An to do this? Now, what unique about that is not necessarily advanced programming or algorithm or AI, but in fact, it's a very enriched database. They would enable the machine to learn faster. So you're talking about 30 million records. Many insurance companies in this country probably can have that access, or you cannot correlate that database together. So that happened in China. So our verdict is out there, which way is better, but that's...
Okay, I want to go to Q&A, but before we start Q&A, please start thinking about your questions. I want to show this last video that gives you a sense of China's effort at, a soft power. We play that last video, please.
I like to build a world and furnished it with love. Grow apple trees and honey beets and snow white turtle doves. I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I like to hold it in my arms and keep it company. I like to see the world for once, all standing hand in
Cheryl, can I just point out that,
Yes.
you know, Xinjiang, the western part of China, is prime BRI territory. And I'd just like to point out that I think there are 1 million arbitrarily detained Turkic Muslims in that part of the country who would love to tell the world their stories. Let's just be clear about that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I think we have also microphones, please, here in the front. The first question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Max, and I have a question for Sophie. Since you've been in China for how many years now with human rights?
Actually, can you also state your name? I'm sorry, your name.
Yeah, my name is Max, and
Max.
yeah, I've been studying here.
Where are you from? Okay.
I was born in China, and I studied in Canada, now I work in the U.S.
Oh, thank you.
So I have a question for Sophie. Just, do you think like human rights is part of like what U.S. would be asking in terms of, you know, developing future relationship with China? Is that a part of the consideration?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a part consistently of lots of different U.S. administrations' policies. But I think what's more important is that it is of interest to people across China, you know, who want to be able to have more of a say in how their lives are governed, or, you know, how education policies are determined, or how they're treated in their everyday lives. So I think it's not just about, you know, what other governments do, but rather demands from people in China themselves.
So this is not part of the U.S. foreign policy, saying trying to get China better on human rights.
Well, it is.
And is that? I mean, I guess I'm sorry. Let me correct my question. I wouldn't take more than 5 seconds. If human rights is part of the U.S. foreign policy requirements or pursue it, why would U.S. still have the? Why would Saudi Arabia is the closest ally for U.S. in the Middle East?
Oh, I would love to put you in touch with my colleagues who work on Saudi to answer that question for you. I'm not very well equipped to do it, but.
You know, this is more like U.S. side, like from the U.S. perspective, why you choose Saudi and then go against China?
Right. I mean, look, any government, let me put it to you this way. I think all of the governments that say that human rights is a priority for them around the world are inconsistent. And sometimes they're hypocritical. And sometimes they're serious, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes you watch them being very tough on one abusive government and going very easy on another. And it really undercuts, you know, in our view, the efficacy of those interventions. I think, you know, the kind of consistency that's needed across different countries in different kinds of situations is what makes that kind of diplomatic intervention credible and effective.
Next question. Oh, here. Can we get the microphone? Yes, sir.
Hi, it's Michael Chewy from the McKinsey Global Institute. Would love to get a sense from the panelists in terms of the prospects for economic reform within China. I mean, I'm sure Lighthizer has a list of things that's far beyond additional soybean sales, but what are those prospects given the retrenchment that we've seen recently?
Well, this goes back to a question that Cheryl was asking, why has there been such a change in U.S. attitudes towards China? I think part of it is, for several decades, they were on the march towards a much more market-oriented economy that seemed getting familiar standard practices, and in the last 7 or 8 years, maybe 10, you could debate that, they've moved much more in a statist direction. The state has been playing a much greater role in resource allocation. Private firms are getting squeezed out. And that's one of the reasons growth has slowed down, because private firms are so much more productive. Could this change? Maybe. I think Xi Jinping has been the big advocate of we need to have bigger state companies. And they have gotten much bigger, but they've gotten much less efficient at the same time. It's slowed down China's growth. Maybe Xi Jinping will decide he's paying too great a price. I think his view is he's getting more political control. With a bigger state sector, you have more instruments of control. And he has emphasized repeatedly the party must control everything, everywhere, all the time. Well, maybe he will decide that he's giving up too much growth and he'll go back towards a more market-oriented reform strategy that would lead to more efficiency, higher growth, but maybe at the cost of some political control.
I agree.
I don't see many signs.
I agree with Nick, but
direction.
I agree with you very much. But I need to add something our panel hasn't done, which is talk about the downside in U.S.-China relations. Ambassador Lighthizer has talked about reformers, and then these pressure will help them. But there's another very likely scenario. China will sign the agreement and then proceed to cheat. And there will be no changes. If anything, this will strengthen our hawks in Washington, D.C., who've recently formed a committee on the present danger from China. They don't even want to have trade talks. The Defense Department's already announced China is the #1 military threat to America. It's not Iran, North Korea, not terrorism anymore. That's the official strategy. The Department of Justice had a speech recently, Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, really harsh attack on China and the rule of law having no chance. And therefore, the FBI has begun to talk a lot about arrests inside the United States for economic espionage. They want to change the Foreign Agents Registration Act so someone on this panel who talks in a very pro-China way, if he receives benefits from China and doesn't report himself as a foreign agent, which is easy to do, but many people don't, he goes to jail for 5 years each time he does this. So military, Department of Justice, FBI, crackdowns by USTR, China refuses to compromise or agree to the trade agreement. That's just the beginning of a really sharp move toward what they call hua in China, a deterioration in U.S.-China relations, moving back toward a Cold War style approach. We haven't talked much about that on this panel. I'm trying to be nice to China, but I need everybody to understand in the audience, you're talking about really major friction and possible war. We have 2 articles recently in International Security and Foreign Affairs, leading journals, about nuclear escalation by China in the event of a conflict with the Americans. So this is very scary, and your question implies, and I tend to agree with you, wouldn't it be nice if China carry out reforms and if the trade deal helps that? But if it doesn't work that way, we're looking at a very serious downturn.
That's because they want to dominate the world, right?
No, it's because we have, President Trump has said this many times, our previous presidents have let them get away with it. They're not stupid in Beijing. If they can grow faster through theft and many other measures that they shouldn't have taken, why not? So now somebody's saying, standing up to them, and the impressive thing is the congressional support. Nancy Pelosi didn't vote for China to join the WTO. 7 senators have written to, all Democrats, have written to Trump, warning him, don't make a soft deal. Chuck Schumer, the second Trump did not put the 25% tariffs on March 2nd, that afternoon, Senator Schumer, important because he's the Democrat leader in the Senate, tweeted, this was a mistake. You've let down American workers. You should have gone for their full 25% tariffs.
But it
so
really
are the
is.
Democrats opposing all this and working for China? No. They're criticizing the president for being too soft.
But it has escalated because China has ramped up. I mean, not only the state striking back, but also Xi Jinping has now become ruler for life, his life. So I think things have changed too.
Yes, making false promises. He promised President Obama, I won't militarize the South China Sea. Then he did it. Promised President Obama, no more cyber attacks on American companies. 5 indicted hackers, no real change.
Right.
So this is not happy.
Steve, you wanted to say something?
Do we have time for another session? I mean, look, just a couple of things. The question was asked about Chinese reforms. China's about transition, so it's definitely making important transitions from exports and investment to consumption, from manufacturing to services, from high levels of saving to absorbing that saving to fund its social safety net, and from imported to indigenous innovation. So reforms need to be measured against those transitions, and the fact is that they are occurring. The point that Michael just made about Ambassador Lighthizer trying to negotiate tough terms on China, and this has broad support across the political spectrum. His report that he published a little over a year ago, which contains all of these allegations about forced technology transfer, innovation policy, intellectual property rights, cyber, you name it, is really a shoddy report. It's done by a bunch of lawyers who really have not assembled good, hard evidence. And the poster child is this notion of forced technology transfer through joint venture agreements, saying that American companies, if they want to do business in China, are coerced into turning over the crown jewels of what they can do. He admits, go read the report. Page 19 of the report, he says, I have no evidence of this. I'm going to rely on proxy surveys to demonstrate that American companies are uncomfortable in doing business in China. I know plenty of companies engaged in joint ventures who are not dumb enough to turn over their proprietary technologies to their Chinese partners. And the idea that this is forced is based on unsubstantiated evidence. And this is unfortunately the way these negotiations are taking place. A lot of the issues are so important, but they're not supported by good evidence. And that's a key issue.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think we'll have to end on that note. And so I want to give great thanks to Nick, Michael, Sophie, Steve, and Perry. Thank you very much.